All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for joining the stream. Well, thanks to no one right now because no one's on yet, but good to be here. And I will just give everyone a few minutes to join. I'm running a few minutes late, so thanks for bearing with me. We've got our first person joining. Welcome. Type something in the chat if you are just making your way in. Say hello. Let me know if you've got any questions. Any questions for the HSC? Have you guys been given any assessments? Is anyone here from another year or another state and you've got essay questions that you want help with? What's up, Jack? Good to see you again. Always appreciated. Let me know if you've got any more questions, Jack, in addition to last time. Any more assessment, guidance, or notifications? Feel free to put some info in there. A couple of people submitted some questions that they want me to deconstruct, whether they are for assessments or they're just draft questions, but we'll get to those very shortly. But just want to make sure everyone's checked in, see if there's any initial questions that you guys have that I might be able to answer. So any questions to do with essay feedback, any modules, anything English related, just put it in the chat. And we'll go from there. So, Jack, how's everything going in terms of your studies at the moment? How's the term progressing? Here we go. Love the website. That's jedl.com. Thanks very much for the feedback. Appreciate that. Yeah, we flood our resources. These are our top tier resources. We flood them with techniques and really helpful analysis. There's some kind of essay examples as well in there, some worked examples. So glad you're finding those useful. If anyone else wants access to our best resources for the HSC or for other years as well, year 7 to 12 for English, check out jedl.com. That's where you'll find our top-notch resources, super practical. Lots of macro and micro techniques specified. So appreciate the feedback, Jack. And for anyone else wondering, that is, I'll just put the URL there, jedl.com, no surprise. Okay, well, I'm going to get straight into it. I'm going to try and keep this session shorter, but if people come on and ask more questions, I'll make sure I get to those. So let me just share my screen here. And let's see how we go with this. I'm just going to set this up. Do let me know if things are showing up okay for you guys. So I am going to pull this up now. Here we go. And I'm just going to have a look at how that's showing. Hopefully that's showing okay for everyone. Going to do a breakdown now. I'm going to zoom in on this as well. I just want to check out my options here. I think that's good. I'll keep it at this. I'll keep it at this so you can see me. Let's zoom in a bit on this question. So here is a question that has been asked by a student. They want to know, how should this multimodal essay question be approached? Let me start that again. They want to know, how should this multimodal essay question be approached and what ideas and concepts need to be dealt with? So here is a question that a student is asking. The question is, discuss the role of storytelling in inviting the responder to see the world differently. Their specific text, their prescribed text for English, is The Merchant of Venice. But I'm going to deal with this question generally, so no matter what text you're doing, this will apply. So let's have a look at the question, break down the key terms, and then we'll talk about some different ideas and concepts. Ideas and concepts are basically the same thing, by the way, that you should deal with or that you could deal with. There's no real shoulds with the particular ideas and concepts, but I can certainly give you the aspects of the rubric and the module itself that you should be targeting when responding to this question. So let's have a look at the question. Let's break it down. So discuss the role of storytelling. Okay, we'll pause there. First key term has popped up, the role of storytelling. Storytelling is clearly a word that we want to flood in our response. We want to flood our response. We want to pepper this in, but we also want to flood it. if that makes sense. Okay. It needs to be peppered in the micro, in the sense that when you use it in a sentence, it's not dominating the sentence in the sense that you're just repeating the question, but it's in there. It's in there somewhere. You're saying something about storytelling, and you do that throughout the entire essay. So you pepper it into the sentences. It ends up being everywhere. That's one of the key words that you want to do that with. Okay, discuss the role of storytelling in inviting the responder to see the world differently. So I would say the other key term or phrase in this particular question is see the world differently. So let's have a look at see the world differently. Okay. Now, are there other key words? Oh, yes. Discuss, role, inviting, responder. Sure. Every word in the question is important because they gave you that exact question for a reason. But your job is to discern which one or two key phrases or key parts of that question are absolutely key, so much so that they're the kinds of words that should almost appear in every single sentence of your response. So that's what we're trying to work out here. And I think we've just got to the crux of the question by highlighting those two different phrases. The next step, now that we've identified the key terms of the question, and anyone can use this practice, right? Identify the key terms of the question. Now we unpack those key terms of the question. So let's write them out. So we've got storytelling, keep it in bold, okay? And then we've got see the world differently, okay? Now let's deal with storytelling first. These terms are directly from the text and human experiences rubric. They're from the module description. That's where any question for the common module or any other module is going to be drawn. They're going to come from the module description, that rubric that you get that sets out the guidelines for the unit, what you're meant to take away from the unit. Storytelling, see the world differently. These are definitely in there. Okay, so storytelling, first question we ask, because now we want to unpack, we ask ourselves the mini question. So I'm going to ask myself, what type of storytelling? Well, this is a great one for everyone watching because no matter what text you're doing, you can apply it to your text. So in this case, this student is doing The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, and that is a play. So that is a drama that is written in the dramatic form. So we would say we have a dramatic mode, a type of storytelling. Look at that, I already knows what I want to say. Perfect. It's the dramatic mode of storytelling. Now, that's the first step. I'm not saying we can't do more with this storytelling word, but that's a good start. A lot of people are just going to keep saying storytelling without saying the type of storytelling. Well, if you're studying a play, it's the dramatic mode of storytelling. If you're studying a film, it's the cinematic mode of storytelling. Okay, if you're doing prose fiction, right? You've got a narrative, you've got a prose fiction mode of storytelling. So you need to be specific about the type of storytelling by tying it to the form or text type that you're studying. So there's the first easy tip, simple tip to implement so that you can be specific about that key word. Okay, so we've got a dramatic mode of storytelling. What else can we say about the type of storytelling? Is it a challenging kind of storytelling? Is it confronting? Maybe. So we can actually also use some adjectives to go with it. So dramatic mode is a very technical type of storytelling, but then we can also say it's a visceral story. And you can use story or telling, stories. You can use any variation of that word storytelling, but don't use synonyms. Don't use words that are similar to storytelling. Use the actual word storytelling or tell stories or stories. You need to use some variation or derivative of that word so that the marker always knows you're engaging with the actual question at hand. Why would you use a different word when you can use the exact word that the question wants? People think they can outsmart the question by using synonyms. They're getting clever with it. No, you're not. You're just using a similar word, and that's all you're doing because you're convincing yourself that by using a synonym, you're engaging directly with the question, but you're not. You haven't actually unpacked it. You just used a word that has a similar meaning. So use the exact word, but expand on it. See here how in our essay, if we use the word storytelling, but we also put dramatic mode of storytelling there, you've got the expansion. We're expanding on it. That's what the unpacking process here is doing for us. We're preparing to expand. So maybe it's a visceral story. A visceral story means a story that you can really feel. It evokes a response from you, often because it's quite confronting and it makes you squirm sometimes. Maybe it's got very graphic imagery, bodily imagery, things like that. Okay, it's visceral. It hits you to the core, basically. Okay, it evokes an internal response, and it's often quite confronting. Okay, maybe that's the case here with Merchant of Venice. Could be quite confronting, visceral story, but it could also be a kind of subversive story. A subversive story means like a challenging story. Okay, it's a challenging story. Maybe it plays around with the genre. Like here, with the comedic form, it actually subverts the comedic genre. I say form, genre interchangeably sometimes, but the play itself is kind of like, the word is a bastardized comedy, right? So it kind of experiments with that form. It subverts or challenges our expectations of what to expect from a comedy. Okay, so notice how I'm linking things to do with genre as well, and probably style. You can go that far in terms of answering this storytelling piece. Okay, in terms of the other things about storytelling, you've got to think about who's telling the story. In this case, it's a play, so it's very dialogic. It means it's just driven by dialogue and stage directions, right? But even the stage directions, I'm going to note stage directions here. Just noting it because it's to do with how the story is structured, right? We should think about the structure. If you're out there and you're studying a novel, is the structure linear? Are they telling the story linearly, or is it a non-linear? Is there a non-linear structure there? A non-linear structure for the story, right? And why is that? Why are they doing it in that way? Okay, if you're studying something like 1984, that's a dystopian text. So you could say we've got this kind of dystopian or dystopic, one of those words, either will do, dystopic storytelling. It never likes dystopian. Dystopian form of storytelling, okay, or something like that. All of these things allow you to expand on that word storytelling. I'm just going to jump back over, make sure I'm not missing some comments. Yes, it is quite similar to the 2023 question about enriching the world. It's very similar. So there are only so many questions they can make up with the rubric, which is why you should get super familiar with the module. Okay, now what and what type is just one thing. We also need to examine other mini questions here. Mini questions are those questions that will help you unpack the key terms when you're thinking about it. What about how? What about why? What about so what? Who can even be relevant sometimes? Okay, so if we look at how, all right, well, how is the story told is going to be a very similar answer to what type of storytelling, right? We also haven't actually answered what the role of storytelling is. So I'm gonna make sure we expand on that as well, because there's storytelling and there's the type of storytelling, but there's also what is the role of storytelling itself. So I'm going to separate, now that I look at this, I'm going to separate what type and what. I'm going to come back to how. Okay. What is the role of storytelling? Okay. What is the role of storytelling? The reason I didn't highlight role of storytelling in full is because I didn't want to confuse you or mislead you into thinking that you have to keep saying role of storytelling, role of storytelling. The more words that you highlight or that you identify as key terms in terms of like a phrase, role of storytelling versus storytelling, the harder it's going to be for you to expand and say something specific, because you're always going to try and say that group of words together. They're bunched together. They're glued. You never want to look at it that way. Yes, role of storytelling could be seen as a key term in itself or as a whole, but break it up so that when you use the words, you're more flexible. If you're only dealing with one key term at a time in your sentences, it's way easier to maneuver around it. Whereas if you're trying to constantly say role of storytelling, that greatly restricts what you're able to say before and after and how you're able to shape your sentence, because you're kind of locked in with that phrase. It'll compromise your ability to be flexible. So that's why I didn't highlight the whole thing with role of storytelling. Having said that, we do need to be careful. Maybe for the purpose of this, just to be absolutely clear, I'll highlight it in blue, but I'll separate the of so that you understand you can approach each of those differently or separately. But of course, we are talking about the role of storytelling. You can't separate that fact. So what is the role of storytelling? Well, is it to challenge? It does suggest where it wants you to go. Role of storytelling in inviting the respondent to see the world differently. So you can kind of answer the role thing with the see the world differently one, but just off the bat, like a story might confront our worldview. It might challenge our preconceptions. I'm just putting in a few examples that might apply or might not apply to your text, but this is how you think about it, at least. So confront our worldview, challenge our preconceptions. I'm thinking about inviting us to do something or seeing the world differently. I want to think about what role that plays and how it plays that role. So there are a couple of examples. If we're talking about how is the story told, again, you would use things like, this is where you refer to things like the structure, things like the narration style. So is in 1984, third person limited narration. That is the form of the storytelling. That's how the story's told. Okay, narration, e.g., 1984, which should be spelt out, by the way, I'm just doing this for short. 1984 is told, and I'll make this super clear. The dystopian story of 1984 is told and tell, that counts. That's a derivative of tell, so we can use that. The dystopian story of 1984 is told from a third-person limited narrative perspective. Fantastic, right? Now you're telling me something about that storytelling component. You're telling me how it's told. Whose perspective is it told from? It focalizes Winston's point of view. Okay, there's an example. So you look at things like structure and narration and other aspects of the style generally that will play into how the story is told. Okay, other things. So if you're talking about a play, maybe there are soliloquies. It tells the story through soliloquies. What does that do? Well, a soliloquy, better get that plural right. A soliloquy is actually really important because it shares information unique to a particular character, but it's in secret, right? Only the audience can hear what that character's saying. So it creates kind of intrigue. It creates a kind of dramatic irony because we know something that other characters don't. So there's intrigue, irony, maybe there's duplicity, like we're hearing one thing from them, but they're actually deceiving the audience. Okay, there could be a duplicity. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm looking at all the different features that make up the way the story is told, the form of the story, not the ideas in it, the form, because we're going to connect that to the ideas. And then I'm actually breaking it down and thinking, okay, what would a soliloquy do? Well, it might create intrigue, dramatic irony, duplicity. Maybe it reveals, maybe it creates empathy because we're just empathy, and it humanizes a character because we're just hearing what they say, right? There might also be monologues, which are very similar, but they could be with other characters around, like or a speech. Okay, so you have to look at all the elements that make up the way your story is told, and then you'll connect them to the see the world differently component. Okay, now why is the story told in a certain way? We don't have to worry about answering that just yet because we'll answer the why with the see the world differently. Unless there's a very particular reason that it's told in that way, which there probably is. I mean, I will go into why now. Actually, I didn't want to go through every single one, but why not? Why? Why not? No. Why? So why gets you to actually consider context. So why is the story told in this way? And I could do this for the why that connects to see the world differently, to this phrase down here. Context. But Shakespeare, for instance, tells this story in this way because of all of these contextual influences. Maybe there's anti-Semitism going on. Maybe there are new cultural values that are being emphasized, right? So maybe there's a shift in religious values or religious fervor. Maybe the people are more passionate about it. Shift in religious values, say what they are. Okay, maybe different political values. Consider all of those things. I'm not going to be too specific here. You get the idea. Consider specific contextual influences for the why question. So what's the significance that it's told from that particular mode? So it's the fact that it's a play. Why is it important that it's a play? This just basically means, why is it important that it's a play and not something else? What's the impact? What's the specific impact? Now we've kind of already answered that in terms of confronting, challenging. We feel like we're there. When you watch a play, it's very visceral. So we can say visceral because we feel like we're there. It's also very, it's communal. Theater is a communal experience. Communal, collective, human experience. Good if you can link these things back to the rubric. Bonus points for that. Okay, and then who, I keep saying I'll skip things, but I don't end up skipping them. But in this case, who would be good for like 1984 if it's told from Winston's perspective, essentially. So you could kind of factor that in. These are all just considerations. These are to help you really unpack the question so that when you create a thesis and you write your introduction and you write your body paragraphs, you have all of this ammunition in a way to fire. You're firing this ammo. You've got all of these different ways of attacking the key terms of the question. And that, as we said at the beginning, is going to allow you to flood your essay with it. Okay? All right. So let's do see the world differently very quickly. I'm just going to check over at some of the questions. Give me one sec. These Lex, you have a draft in? Ooh, I've got whatever was submitted before this started. So if you're still keen to submit something, put it on there. And if I don't get to it, I'll have a look at in the next one. But Lex, if you have a particular question you want me to give you some feedback on, or maybe a sentence or two, you can drop it in the chat, okay? And then Horse iOS, when will you look at students' essays? Well, I'm just working with what students gave me, okay? So the responses I got for this one were mainly around unpacking questions for people's assessments. So that's what I'm focusing on. But if you have responses, we shot out a link. We put it in our newsletter. Okay, we have a newsletter we send out every week. We put a link in there for you to share your essays. You could, not full essays necessarily, but like a paragraph or so, or even less, with questions, and we'll deconstruct it. But you have to submit it. You have to submit the form before the session starts. So make sure you do it before the next one. As we'll probably try and do another one in the next week or two, maybe next 2 weeks. Okay, so looking at this, role of storytelling. Okay, we've unpacked it. How does discuss the role of storytelling in inviting the responder to see the world differently? Okay, how are we invited to see the world differently? We know how the story is being told and what impact that could have. Like, it's a play and it's going to be very impactful because we feel like we're there. Okay, great. What about see the world differently? So I'm not going to bother with what type, although, again, I will do it because we can think in that way if we like. How are we seeing the world differently? Well, what type of world do we live in, right? What is the type of world that we live in? For instance, if the play is about like prejudice, maybe it's a prejudicial world, okay? Prejudicial world. Maybe it's a hopeless world. Like if in 1984, it's pretty hopeless. Maybe it's a totalitarian world. If you're doing a text like The Crucible, again, that you could argue that that's also somewhat totalitarian, but it's not a dystopian one, that one. But if we're talking about The Crucible, you'd be talking about a world in which autonomy has been stripped because everyone lives in fear. So it's a world of fear. It might be a world of exclusion. So you can use world of. The word of is really good to expand here, or you can actually use an adjective before the word world, okay? So notice how the phrase is see the world differently, but I'm zooming in on this word, world, because I don't want to constantly say that whole phrase together, or I'm just going to repeat the question. So you got to kind of like pick it apart a little bit, all right? Now, how do we see the world differently? How do we see? I'm just going to like our what, how, why, so what questions, thinking what's going to give me some material here that I can work with. So how do we see the world differently? Well, maybe it challenges our preconceptions of, racial division. Maybe it empowers us to embrace perceived differences. Maybe if it's like 1984 or The Crucible, it urges us to think critically and voice our dissent when injustice or justice is violated, right? So these kind of words will help you actually get to the crux of what the question is asking and provide a specific answer. All right, so that is us unpacking this question. You could go and apply more questions, as I said, these mini questions: what type, how, why, so what, who. That'll help you get the substance there, okay? So student wants to know how to approach it, what ideas and concepts need to be dealt with. Well, hopefully that's given you some material there. But if you're doing the Merchant of Venice, talking about the role of storytelling, I've covered that. It's dramatic mode of storytelling. Think about all the aspects that make up a play: soliloquies, monologue, speeches, stage directions. Think about key moments of tension. Think about climax. Think about resolution. Think about the narrative arc there, the dramatic arc. Think about characterization. Think about whether there are any character foils, characters who intentionally contrast or juxtapose one another, okay? You need to consider all those features of the form. So that's some material for that. In terms of seeing the world differently, again, I think a lot of what I just said would be relevant for Merchant of Venice in terms of challenging our preconceptions of racial division. Maybe it's about gender roles. Maybe you want to focus on that idea of embracing perceived differences, realizing, so it illuminates the paradox, right? The paradoxical tension. Maybe it's just showing us something. Illuminates the paradoxical tension between being a victim and a villain, like Shylock in the play, right? So you can talk about how he's both. That's the paradox, right? And how that is kind of like a vicious, self-perpetuating, means it keeps going, cycle, right? Unless, and let's hone in on this. Well, I won't say unless, I'll say if, right? Perceived adversaries, that's like someone's enemies, right, are begrudged, right? So it's like the relevant emotions here are like resentment, bitterness, right? Resentment, etc. Resentment breeds resentment. It's an awful cycle. You kind of need to forgive. There's a necessity to forgive and accept differences, right? Otherwise, the cycle, the fatal cycle continues, and you see what happens in the Merchant of Venice as a result, right? There's injustice, and everyone turns on each other, and no one's really there to support anyone. So there's some ideas that I would get into. If you're looking at Merchant of Venice specifically, and you're doing like a 3-paragraph structure, let's have a look at that. Good structure for it. There are a few kind of key things you could look at. I don't want to be overly prescriptive here, but again, I always consider, okay, what's the problem? What is the struggle as a result of that problem? And is there a resolution? But there are many other ways to structure an essay. But if we think about a problem here in terms of, the question's so general, it's a very broad question. That's the first thing. It doesn't give us a particular theme. It just says, how are we invited to see the world differently? So that actually gives you the freedom to pick the exact concepts and the vocabulary that you like, that you want to focus on, okay? So for the problem here, what is the problem? Maybe we live in a world where, prejudice breeds prejudice. So like people who are prejudiced against, like Shylock, become prejudicial towards others. So that's a vicious cycle. Okay, these are just examples. Okay, the struggle then, maybe you explore the struggle of someone like Portia, right? Maybe you explore someone like Portia, it could be someone else. Maybe you want to also look at how materialism is treated and how people have the misguided values, right? We live in a world where, why don't I do that actually? We live in a world where values are misguided, where values are superficial and thus misguided. They don't lead to happiness, but we'll address the happiness point later, right? So there you can talk about, the materialism. You could talk about, the racial differences there, okay? There's also a consequent struggle. You could look at like Portia in terms of her being alienated, like her path is predetermined as a woman, right? Her path is predetermined. So she must self-fashion. She must pretend to be someone she's not. She pretends to be a judge, okay? She pretends to be a male judge, right? And you have to think about the deeper meaning behind that, right? She is deceiving. She's being deceptive. She's being deceptive, and she turns against Shylock, a fellow, I won't say, obviously not a fellow woman, but a fellow minority is what we're going to say there. Okay. And then resolution. You can discuss whether there is a resolution. Do people end up happy? Our expectations are probably subverted. Our expectations of a comedy are subverted here because people end up miserable because of these. They have the misaligned values. And you need to look at context as to why there is this value shift and why people are valuing the wrong things. So that's a pretty detailed structure there for how you could split 3 body paragraphs, and then you'd provide evidence for that. So hopefully that helps you. All right, so there's that. Let's go to the next one. Through storytelling, we become more aware of the emotions that motivate responses to universal human experiences. Okay, so I'll read it again. So this is an essay question based on the common module. Through storytelling, we become more aware of the emotions that motivate responses to universal human experiences. Okay, very similar to the last one with the storytelling component. I don't need to go through that in as much detail, but again, storytelling is a key word. Through storytelling, what is the mode of storytelling? Are you studying a play? Then it's dramatic mode of storytelling. Are you studying fiction? Fictional mode of storytelling, if it's like prose fiction. Okay, if we're looking at Vertigo. What type of text is it? And what are the features? What is the structure of the story? How is the story told? Is it told through anecdotes? Is it told linearly, as in chronological order? Or is it told non-linearly? Does it flash back and then forward? So you need to consider the structure. Whose perspective is the story told from? Okay, so I've just given you a few key components to look at when you're deconstructing storytelling. When you're looking at the voice or the narration style, it could be first person, could be third person omniscient, if it's like an all-knowing narrator, or it could be third person limited if it's kind of biased towards one particular character's point of view. So keep those elements in mind if you are dealing with the word storytelling or any word to do with the form of the text or the mode of representation that's present. Okay, it's very common for something to do with form, which storytelling is, to be incorporated into a question. So be prepared for that breakdown. Now, through storytelling, we become more aware of the emotions that motivate responses. Okay, so it's got a heavy emphasis on emotions. We need to be more aware of the emotions that motivate responses to universal human experiences. Okay, so don't confuse motivate there with motivations in general, because it's a very specific type of motivations. We're saying how are the relevant emotions here motivating or causing a response? So it's kind of jammed in another rubric term there in motivate, but the key word is emotions, and then linking that to a certain response to a universal human experience. Now, human experience is almost always in a question, but it's not that key, even though you have to use that word a lot, right? So because you need to define what the human experience is, and you'd be doing that in any common module essay because it's all about human experiences as they are represented in your text. So I'll still put a little highlight on it, but there are usually only 1 to 2 key words that you should be using almost every sentence of your essay. And in this case, it's the storytelling and emotions, and it's probably a third one here, responses, right? Motivating responses, but response is more important. What are those responses? So in the text you're looking at, what are the emotions and what are the responses to certain human experiences? So if we were breaking this down, human experience, we'll start with human experiences. What are they in this novel? What are they in this text? Okay, break those down. Literally make a list Make a list of those. The next thing then is, what are the responses? What are the responses to those human experiences? Okay. What are those responses? Okay, and that's focused on the responses. All right. Is it positive? Start with, is it positive, negative? Maybe there are some positive, maybe there are some negative. Okay. List the positive ones. Don't use the words positive and negative in your response, but use positive and negative as a kind of springboard, right? Off which to figure out what the more specific terms are here. So, what are the positive responses, right? Is there kind of inclusion? Do people include each other? Is there friendship, embracing friendship, love, connection, etc., right? They might be a response to something. Or is there fear? I don't want to confuse this with the emotions, actually. So careful not to confuse or mix up the emotions with the response. Okay, so here we are. Negative, there might be a rejection of something or an idea or someone. Okay, there might be a betrayal or something like that. Maybe that's the human experience, but you need to think about those negative responses, positive responses, and so forth. So you can use positive and negative to guide that. Now, the last one there is emotions, because we've talked about storytelling. We've become aware of that. So with emotions, you have to specify what they are. So is it fear? Is it, you could say, kind of suffering, I suppose, as a generic one, but try and be as specific as possible every time you bring up something to do with the emotions, right? So what are other emotions? Is it love? Of course, happiness, sadness, people say, of course. But try and mix them up. Try and get away from happy, sad, good, bad, positive, negative. Always good to avoid those. But again, you can use those to inspire other emotions that might be relevant. Okay. All right. So yeah, fear, suffering, love. I'm trying to think of like general ones that might apply to a few different things. Anger, hostility, warmth. Okay. The list could go on, depends what you're studying. So you would come up with that particular list. Great. So that will help you unpack that. Now, let me show you how you would address the storytelling part in your essay. When it says through storytelling, we become aware of. So you would say something like, it is through the, if you were doing a play, dramatic mode of storytelling. It's through the dramatic mode of storytelling that Shakespeare, and then we go up here, we become more aware of that Shakespeare enlightens responders, right? With the power of fear, fear, or we could say isolation or something like that. With the power of fear, I'm trying to say maybe loneliness, maybe isolation, isolated. Okay, with the power of isolation to motivate an individual's revenge, right? Because that's also what happens. Okay, the power of isolation to motivate an individual's revenge. Boom. All right. So that's an example, but you could say something like, it is through the dramatic mode of storytelling that the author does this. Okay. And you can apply that to whatever text you're doing. All right. So just taking a look at some other questions now, I'm going to stop sharing there. Hopefully that helps you. That's how I would approach it. Break it down, come up with your 3-paragraph structure. Remember, it is problem, paragraph 1. What's the struggle or the response? Not to get confused with the response in the question, because you need to address response in every paragraph because it's a key term of the question. But struggle, response, consequence of the problem. Okay, and then is there a resolution of some kind? Okay, so that should help you with a framework. All right, let's go back into this and let's have a look at couple of questions here. So for my 1984 essay, last time you gave some great ideas on the shades of possibility. I remember that humans are motivated to find in moments of darkness. Just not sure how to answer to what extent. Okay, good question. When you get a to what extent question, you don't have to use the word extent. What does need to be clear, though, is the extent to which you agree. And the way you do that is use language, especially in your thesis and your introduction, that demonstrates where you sit on the spectrum of definitely agreeing, like fully agree, to fully disagree. So there's a spectrum of how much you agree with the statement you're provided in the question. It says to what extent do you agree? Do you strongly disagree? Do you strongly agree? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Figure out where you sit and then use language that makes it clear. And a really good example is this. Present your argument that agrees, like you come up with a sentence that explains the area that you agree with respect to the question. Okay. So, to what extent is it true? Say the bit that's true to you, and then say the word however. So however is then going to be followed by the extent to which you disagree. Okay. And another way to do it is you start a sentence with a word like whilst da 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 happens, and then say the idea, comma, this also happens, and that's a counter. So it needs to be very clear where you sit by the language, by whether you're using a word like however or whilst. Are you showing two different perspectives? Are you showing an argument and a counter argument within your introduction? And have you made that really clear by using a word like whilst, whereas, however, but, yet? So those 4 words, or those 4 or 5 words, will be really helpful in helping you tell the marker without literally saying, I agree 90% with the question. I agree to a significant extent even. Maybe in a history essay, it's really good to use the word to a significant extent, to a limited extent. In English, you want to have a little bit more flair, and you don't want to avoid the question there, but you want to show it without literally saying the words there. They're not the prettiest words to have to use in an English essay. Okay, so you want to show it through the language rather than, by demonstrating or not demonstrating, by using specific words like extent. Now, let's look back at that spectrum. So you get a statement and you think, that's exactly what I think about the text, so I strongly agree. Can you think of how someone would disagree? Because it's always good to consider why that statement might not be entirely true. It's always good to consider why a statement in a question might not be entirely true, because that's what the sophisticated students do. They think, okay, yes, that is true, but it's not completely true. Rarely is something completely true that they give you in a question. They're actually giving you a statement to test who's going to think critically enough to appreciate how this might not be true. Okay, and that's why you'll use a statement like whilst or however. You'll use those words to frame your agreement, but also your disagreement. Make sure it's clear which one you are siding with. If you were fully agreeing with something, then you would use words like unequivocally, like the text unequivocally, which means like fully, unequivocally represents this. And you go on to expand on that idea that's in the statement. Or you might say something like, in no way does the text suggest this. In fact, it suggests the opposite. Da, 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 da. So you can almost use the words extent there, like in no way or unequivocally, but I would avoid using extent there, because to what extent is not really a key word. That's just the type of question that you'll get in. Hopefully that makes sense. So you use those words, keep it simple. However, but, yet, whilst, whereas, and make sure that if you think you are 100% in agreement, you have thought about any potential way that someone, even if it's not you, might disagree. And it's always good to acknowledge that just a little bit, even if you're really sold on the statement. And if you think you disagree entirely, try and find how you agree just a little bit, and then make it clear in your tone and where your emphasis is in the sentences, how much you disagree, or whether you disagree more than you agree. That should be obvious from the tone of the piece. But make sure you've considered the potential for disagreement or agreement. I would rarely go 100% either side, because that's less nuanced. You want to show nuance. You want to show that you understand the complexity of a topic. And to understand the complexity of a topic, you need to show that you can appreciate multiple perspectives. You need to have your own perspective, and you need to ultimately argue one particular way, but the one way you argue can incorporate two things. So you could say, I'm arguing that this and this are both true, that the statement is correct to this extent, but it's incorrect to this extent. Okay, hopefully that helps. All right, here is the essay question again. Oh yeah, sorry, Jack, I should have looked at this before I did that, but you've got a statement. Of course, the journey is not all dark. As we know, the human experience is one of light and shade. Yeah, you would say you would like, if it, because it's not a definite statement, it's not saying, I mean, it's saying of course, but it's not saying the journey is all dark or the journey is not all dark. It's actually, its position is somewhere on that spectrum in terms of how definite it is about what it's saying. So it's saying the journey is not all dark. As we know, the human experience is one of light and shade. Yeah, so you'd say that whilst, this would be like a whilst situation, right? Whilst the narrative, right, the narrative of 1984 is underpinned by darkness in this way, right? Orwell has preserved, right, a narrow glimmer of hope or light. You can link it to light there by ... right? By suggesting that, it is not too late, or there is still time to rebel, right, et cetera, et cetera. So you could definitely see where the agreement and disagreement would come in there. But I know we talked about that last time, so I won't go into too much detail there. Okay. Two more questions I'll take before we wrap up. So how significant is the difference between to what extent, evaluate, or analyze? My teachers don't really talk about it because they think it's trivial. Thoughts, Jonny? Okay. So what is the difference between to what extent, evaluate, or analyze? Well, there are slight differences, but to be honest, I think it's good advice from your teachers not to overemphasize or overvalue the difference there. It's good to know what the difference is, but in the context of an English essay, generally a lot of the words are interchangeable. I'll tell you the difference though. To what extent is a question that would follow a statement? So the question presents you with a particular perspective, and then it says, to what extent do you agree? All right, it often comes up in that one. And as I just said, when you get a to what extent question, you should be focused on, how do I show that I can appreciate both sides while also showing where I sit on that spectrum of strongly agreeing and strongly disagreeing? Okay, try not to use the words to what extent or extent, but at least use words like however, but, yet, whilst, nonetheless, etc., to show that you can appreciate different positions, conflicting positions. So that's to what extent. And you can also just get a standard question that says, to what extent is the text about this? And you'd say, the text is fundamentally about this, but, there's the but it also contemplates this. And then you can bring in something different or something opposing. So same principle with that, okay? Even if you don't get a statement followed by, to what extent is this true? You could just get a question like, to what extent is this idea represented? Always good to figure out whether you mainly agree or disagree. And then whichever way you lean, make sure you show an understanding and an appreciation of the other side. And that might just be through a word like but or however. Now, evaluate, if it's saying evaluate, that means, again, you do need to consider both sides, just like you did with the to what extent. Evaluate this question, right? Evaluate the extent, or you might get both there. Evaluate how Shakespeare does this or how a text does this. That's actually asking you to demonstrate an appreciation of what is most valuable in the text, how well it does something, and whether it doesn't do something so well or it doesn't explore it. It's a bit of a funny one because you shouldn't really be critiquing how well the composer has written something. That's usually not what it's trying to ask there. But if it does say evaluate, it wants you to make a judgment. It wants you to make a judgment call. But you're always doing that in an essay. So that's to your teacher's point. As I'm thinking and talking about this out loud, I realize every essay that you do for the HSC and really through school is requiring a judgment at the end of the day. Evaluate means, consider both sides, show that you've thought about both sides, or not both sides, it's not always like a side thing, but show that you've considered multiple perspectives here, but don't just provide multiple perspectives. Give us a firm position at the end of the day. And end of the day doesn't mean in the conclusion, even in the introduction. Even in the introduction, you need to state that position, okay? So consider multiple perspectives, weigh them up. Now, you're not actually like spending too much time weighing them up. You've already thought about it and drafted the essay, but make sure you present a firm position after that, okay? After showing that you've at least thought about the agree, disagree positions. So it relates to what extent in that way. And then analyze is provide an analysis, means literally go through and show us evidence that supports your points, but you still need to make points and you still need to present a position. So it's kind of the same as evaluate, right? Analyze is probably the least sophisticated or challenging out of those three that I can see. To what extent evaluate, analyze? Analyze is just analyze, present analysis. Analysis means you've thought about what ideas are explored, how are they explored, how are the ideas explored, so techniques, quotes, and why are they explored, right? Tell me about the context and the authorial intent. What was the author or the composer trying to achieve? That's analysis. How, what, how, why? What, how, why? What are the ideas? How are they presented? That's your evidence, and that's your form as well. And why? And that's why did the author write that in the way they did? And what were they influenced by? Okay, so last question here. If I'm doing your conflict, struggle, and resolution structure, are those my themes? No, that's a really important question. So conflict, struggle, resolution is a framework. So Arman, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Conflict, struggle, and resolution is a framework. They are not the specific words that you use. They are guiding words that are meant to direct your attention to the relevant themes or ideas, okay? So by saying the first paragraph is conflict, conflict is not an idea. Conflict is just a prompt for you. I'm basically saying with that structure, what is the most relevant conflict that's established at the beginning of your text in the first third? What is the conflict? You don't need to use the word conflict. In fact, I would try and avoid it. But after I read your topic sentence, your first sentence of your first body paragraph, it should be clear to me how society or an individual is conflicted. It should be obvious that there's a conflict. I don't need to see the word conflict itself. You can try using that if you like, but that is not the idea or the theme. That is a guide for you to think about what is the core tension in the text. Write a sentence and a paragraph about that, okay? Struggle is saying, well, what's the struggle in response to that problem that you've just defined? Remember, you haven't used the word conflict. You've described and articulated a conflict. You've explained what that conflict is. And now you're going to say, well, what's the consequent struggle? Well, the individual responds by, or the individual is compelled to rebel against Big Brother, okay, if we're doing 1984. All right, so I'll give you some basics here, Arman, for this conflict, struggle, resolution, or problem, struggle, resolution structure, okay? If you're doing 1984 and we're using this structure of conflict, struggle, resolution, conflict could be about individual autonomy, right? Individual autonomy is subdued or repressed or limited, compromised. I'm just chucking out some other words. Individual autonomy, that is your freedom, your individuality, is compromised or limited by, right, the corrupt motivations of a totalitarian state, which is Big Brother. So you could use the word Big Brother or the totalitarian reign of Big Brother. There you go. That's a conflict because you've got the individuality, the freedom going up against the motivation for absolute control that the totalitarian government has, which is Big Brother in 1984. Then you would have the struggle. Well, the struggle might be, well, Winston attempts to rebel to preserve his autonomy. Okay, great. What about structure? Oh, sorry. Oh, you've got resolution. Oh, sorry. What about resolution? What about resolution? See, it's time to stop in a second. If we're talking about resolution, well, is there a resolution? There's not always a resolution, right? But you would say something like, Winston's attempt at rebellion is futile. It's pointless. It's hopeless, as he ultimately surrenders to Big Brother. However, the appendix, right? And you don't have to say the appendix in the topic sentence, but however, there remains a glimmer of hope for future, right? For future resistance or for collective resistance, right? So why do I say there remains a glimmer of hope? Because of the appendix. You must read the appendix at the end of 1984 because it implies that it's not too late. And that's because Orwell is trying to urge us to take some action because he just showed what will happen if we don't. He showed us what can already happen, but he's saying, hey, it's not necessarily definite. Even though it looks like it's definite and we're doomed, the appendix suggests that it's going to take some more time, even beyond 1984, all the way up to 2050, to fully extinguish language and thought as we know it. So there's 3 pretty specific ideas for you to work with. So I hope that helps. All right, CP, can't wait for Mastermind, but I'm so nervous. That's about it. Hey, you won't chicken out. It's going to be fun. It's going to be relaxed. Thanks for joining. That's great to see that you're on. Looking forward to Mastermind. If anyone wants to come on our game show, you get to play for a jackpot, right? You can win at least $100, right? You can walk away with nothing with the format, but we got a new format. It's kind of a jackpot system, but it's exciting. You get some English revision. We'll do some questions like this. Mastermind, have a look on it. Have a look at it on YouTube. Have a look on the channel. There'll be a link under the Mastermind episodes if you would like to apply to try and come on to one of the episodes. But CP, looking forward to, sorry I don't have your full name there, just going with it. But yeah, looking forward to seeing you on the Mastermind. It's very relaxed. Don't worry about it. I'm sure you'll do well and good luck. Looking forward to it. If that's this Saturday, that's really exciting. I'll see you on there. All right, Armin, no worries. So it's better not to specifically state themes. Well, as I said before, like, should you state individuality versus collectivism? You can use those terms. Don't say the text explores individuality versus collectivism. Don't list themes or just use buzzwords. You must frame it as an idea, as a phrase. So I just gave you the example. The novel explores the tension between preserving individuality and conforming to collectivism. Perfect. That's use those 2 words you just said, but I didn't say verses in the middle, and I didn't just confine it to those 2 terms. So hopefully that clears that up. Make sure you give a specific idea, one idea that connects those buzzwords, those terms. Don't just ever list the buzzwords like that. Okay. All right, Charlie. Looks good. So I will see you on Saturday. All good, all good. Congrats on getting in for the next episode. That's very exciting. Thanks everyone else for watching. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for me. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Excuse me. And just before I lose my voice, which is why it's time to go, make sure if you need access to our best resources for essay guidance, craft of writing, creative writing, short answer practice, go to Jettle.com. Jettle.com has all of our best resources on there. You just have to subscribe and you'll get access for the year. So good luck with that. Thanks guys for tuning in. Remember, subscribe to the channel. If you're still watching this and you aren't subscribed to the channel, that's crazy. Please make sure you've done so. Leave some comments as well. Spread the love. Come on, Mastermind. And I'll see you on the next one. We'll try and do one in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to try and be very consistent with these. Please submit responses. Join our mailing list. So when you register on Jettle.com, when you actually sign up, and you can sign up for free, you don't have to add anything, then you'll be emailed information about when I run these, and you can submit responses to get feedback on. You'll also be kept in the loop as to when our feedback platform is released. Remember, we are coming out with a revolutionary feedback platform that's going to allow you to get feedback on demand when you like it from the best. So keep an eye out for that. But if you want to be in the loop, you have to make an account on Jettle.com. You can do that for free. But if you want to add the courses, of course, and get access to the resources, you can subscribe there as well. All right. All the best. See you guys soon. Love you.